Hit. There we go. Good morning again. I want to thank you all so much for joining us for our Black History session of the race cards. My name is Kimberly Allen, and I'm the CEO of Nano Forward. And I have an incredible and incredibly just brilliant group of people with me today who are running tech and who are going to be facilitators. And if you're a facilitator, can you wave your hand just to say hello so people can get to know you and become familiar with your faces? We also have a number of folks who are going through our training process to become facilitators. And so some of them will be co-facilitating and observing the process as they're learning how to continue this work and continue helping people to engage in the conversation. For those of you who might be new to Nano Forward, I just want to start out telling you a little bit about us. We'll talk a little bit about some interesting research facts, really quick highlights, some interesting Jacksonville facts to go along with that before you head into your breakout sessions with your facilitators to have the conversations. Feel free to put your questions in the chat. We have someone monitoring that, Regina Newkirk-Gucci, who is our fantabulous is what I was going to say. That's not even a word, but our fantastic and fabulous programs manager who helped to get us all in this room today. So thank you, Regina. Feel free to put your questions in the chat. So, we'll start out, like I said, just learning a little bit about Nano Forward. For those of you who are new, I want to welcome you to our space. Nano Forward got its start back in 2015, and we were a group of people having conversations just like the ones that you're going to have later on today. And we really modeled our organization and the work we do in the way that has become our mission, that we create spaces for people to have dialogue, to build relationships and learn together so that we can take collective action. And all the work we do is to the end of seeing an end to racism so that all people thrive in Jacksonville and beyond. That is not limited to here, but I do think Jacksonville has the real opportunity to model what it looks like to address our issues with race head on and become a beloved community and a community that fosters reconciliation, even as we hurt and it might be hard. And so the question that I typically get around our organization is there ever an end to racism? And my response is always, sometimes the journey is the process. And so we don't give up on the process of making ourselves better people so that our community is better as a whole. We have 5 key ways that we do our work. The race cards, which you'll experience today, that deck of about 40 questions that helps you all to have the very difficult dialogue that sometimes comes along with, the uncomfortable conversations that come along with talking about race. And, I can't stress enough our fabulous facilitators and how they will help to usher you all through the conversation if this is your first time. But this is a great tool that we launched in 2018 that we have been using across the state and have even launched an app that has gone international with appeal and having folks use this as a way to spark conversations in their communities. We also partner with the Equal Justice Initiative, which if you haven't heard of that before, Brian Stevenson, the lawyer and attorney of the author Just Mercy, also the movie Just Mercy that was released a couple of years ago. He's the figurehead, the visionary behind the work that we do with the Jacksonville Community Remembrance Project, which is the work we do to memorialize victims of racial terror lynchings. And if you have not already, I encourage you to sign up to for our soul collection ceremony that's happening this Sunday for an unknown man. We'll talk more about that at the end, but I just wanted to let you know that work is happening and it is ongoing. We do work around equity advocacy. We want to see policies that are going to help and promote and build up communities that have been typically marginalized or disproportionately affected by negative things. We want to see policies that serve to remove those barriers. And the policies and practices the laws, the legislation that serves to continue to oppress and make it difficult for people from marginalized communities to be, to have their dignity or be seen as whole individuals. We want to make sure that we're reaching out to our legislative bodies to say, we don't want those kinds of policies. And so we invite you to join us in those efforts as well. We host community forums, which gives us an opportunity to showcase the beautiful diversity that is here in our Jacksonville community. And we do that because, quite frankly, there are folks who are fearful of other groups, other populations, simply because they haven't been exposed. They don't know, they don't have people inside of their friend networks who are coming from different groups and different experiences. And so that allows us the opportunity to say, hey, we are all people and you should absolutely reach out and we should build that bridge together. And then lastly, but certainly not least, we have been looking at a lot of research and if you know me, you know that research is in my bones, so I can't just let it go. But we looked at nearly 80 years worth of data between education and housing and politics and civic engagement, you name it. And we see, unfortunately, some of the same things that we saw nearly 80 years ago. In that sometimes, despite our best efforts as a community, as a nonprofit sector, as people who want to see the community thrive, we still have a system or systems that are pushing out negative results for our communities of color. And we know the data is there. And so now it's time to action it. And so we'll talk a little bit about that in today's program. But those are the key ways in which we do our work. And again, we always invite you to be a part of that as we are out in the community trying to make our city better. So to jump right in, I talked about that 80 years worth of data, and we call it the Race in Retrospect Report. And we pulled out just a few highlights that we wanted to share as we're talking about Black History Month, knowing that there are folks who may not have heard some of these things before, or maybe you have, maybe you've known that it's a hunch and you just haven't, sort of delved into it. But we wanted to not take for granted the opportunity to do just a little bit of educating today and sprinkle in some of those key facts that I think you all would appreciate. And so from our report, we've seen what's called the achievement gap typically, in that white students are tending to perform better on our standardized tests than our Black students. But that gap has been shrinking for some time now, although the gap is still pretty large. But the positive note to that, the upside of that, is that graduation rates have increased and improved pretty dramatically over the last few years. And we've seen just a significant spurt in our Black graduation rate, increasing from 71% to 85%. And there's a group who've even done this work, I want to say starting in like 2009, who were looking at African-American males who at the time had about a 25% graduation rate. Now we're seeing numbers in the 70s and 80% of those groups graduating. So that is, fantastic collaboration and community work with the schools and the education sector, but there is still work to go, and we know that for a fact. And so just a little bit of, Black history facts about our city of Jacksonville. I'm sorry, I changed the slide, but a few facts about our city and how we have shown up in the education space. Founded in 1866 to educate freed former slaves, Edward Waters, was college then but university now, is the oldest independent institution of higher learning, as well as the state's first institution established for the education of African Americans. And so after its original downtown location was destroyed by the Great Fire of 1901, land containing the present day campus was acquired along the Kings Road area, the Newtown area, back in 1904. There's also, it's now in Miami Gardens, Florida, The 1,800 student Florida Memorial University was established in 1882 as the Florida Baptist Academy. Later, it became the Florida Normal and Industrial Institute, where two brothers, James Weldon Johnson and John Rosamond Johnson, wrote the words and the music to the very famous Negro national anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing. In 1918, the school relocated to St. Augustine, and in 1968 to its present day South Florida site. And lastly, Bethune-Cookman University, now in Daytona, has its roots back to 1872, when the Cookman Institute was established by Reverend S.B. Darnell, which that name might sound familiar to you, at the intersection of Beaver and Hogan Street in downtown Jacksonville. After it was also destroyed by a fire, the school relocated to its present day site of the Darnell Cookman School of the Medical Arts. And in 1923, the Cookman Institute merged with the Daytona Educational and Industrial Training School in Daytona Beach to become what is now Bethune-Cookman University. So just a couple of interesting ties here to Jacksonville. Again, the Darnell Cookman, which folks may or may not have known, was very integral in the Bethune-Cookman University School. Going back to our Race in Retrospect report, we know in particular around health, Florida, or Jacksonville, I'm sorry, is broken up into 6 health zones. They tend to be grouped by location, proximity to each other, characteristics. And health zone 1 is what is considered the urban core, and it's the only health zone that has a majority residents are Black or African American. And unfortunately, a lot of times you see the layover of many health disparities as well in health zone 1 that our legislators, et cetera, try to address and attack, and making that zone a priority. Seeing things like infant mortality rate in asthma related issues, diabetes, high blood pressure, and those types of things. And this is coupled with, and I'm going to go to the next slide, this housing report, because there's also a history here, just like in many other Southern cities, of redlining, which is how communities were separated so that Black people would be confined to a particular area and would not be able to infiltrate or move to, or have housing loans that would move them out into the suburbs. And so Health Zone 1 was one of those areas that has been redlined. And so we see a lot of those sorts of health issues and things that happen in Health Zone 1, not just by chance or by happenstance. There has been throughout our history just a disinvestment in that area because of redlining, because of wanting to keep certain groups of people separated and out. And that has impacted wealth generation and perpetuated the wealth gap as well, because owning a home is one of the ways that families are allowed to, or have the ability to build wealth. But we see that African Americans tend to have the lowest home ownership rates. And again, these things are not by accident if we're thinking about this sort of historical context of what redlining did. And we actually did a presentation with an insurance group, and we even, talked about how things like life insurance or homeowners insurance, the premiums were high, but the coverage was low for these families. And so all of these things taken together have led to a wealth gap of over $10 trillion, which is a number that I can't even fathom, honestly. And so talking about, sort of this idea of housing and health, we go to the neighborhood of Sugar Hill, which from the late 1800s until the 1960s, Sugar Hill was the neighborhood where Jacksonville's most prominent African Americans lived. And that area was, if you think about present day where Darnell Cookman is, or where U of Health Shands is. It was sandwiched between Springfield and Durkeeville, but that was where the most prominent African Americans, the affluent African Americans, lived. It was a prestigious and upscale community, and it was home to doctors and lawyers, teachers, bricklayers, ministers, morticians, and you name the groups. And they had developed a commune of comfortable, impressive, and spacious homes. Like many of the urban Jacksonville districts, the neighborhood became a streetcar suburb. Former Sugar Hill residents included Abraham Lincoln Lewis, A.L. Lewis, you all might know by that name, the A.L. Lewis Fund that is now presently at the Chamber, is named in honor of Mr. Lewis and also Eartha and M. White, so the Lewis and White Black Chamber. But Mr. Lewis was the owner and founder of the Afro-American Life Insurance Company. William Raines, a high school principal, and Sarah Blocker, a school teacher who took the Duval County school system to court for equal working rights for African-American teachers. Sugar Hill would eventually become the victim of large development projects, and these include the construction of I-95 through the neighborhood's heart, the continued expansion of the Shands Medical Center, and urban renewal. More than 75% of the families were relocated outside of the neighborhood after their homes were demolished in the late 1960s by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So the last area we'll talk about is the justice and legal system that we covered in our reports. And in 2020, JSO officers shot 14 people, and that was the most in a decade. And between 2010 and 2016, there were more than 2/3 of those shot by police were Black or African American. And in the last 4 years, we know that Black victims of police shootings have represented 40 to 57% of the total folks who were killed by police. And Florida in general just has the highest incarceration rate in the nation. The US average is 698 per 100,000, and Florida's rate is 833 per 100,000. And unfortunately, we send more children to adult court in jail than any other state. And I'll tell you just from a little bit more of a glimpse into the organization, the police shootings that we were seeing around the country had a lot to do with our start and having conversations about the emotions, that the visceral reactions that came from seeing and hearing and witnessing just the tragedy and the trauma that was born out of police shootings that still continue to this day, that were really a part of our country's beginnings. And so this is why we come together. We want people to be able to have the conversations to help us move forward, to help us advocate, so that we can say there's no child that should be tried as an adult. And we should, how do we work together to make sure that that happens? How do we let our elected officials know that this is what we want to see going forward? And so the next, or the last fact that I'll share today is that in 1935, the Pension Bureau of a pioneering Black-owned business, Jacksonville's Afro-American Life Insurance Company, bought 33 acres of shorefront property on Amelia Island. Mr. Lewis, who I talked about previously, was the Afro's president. He invited company employees to make use of the beach. And he hosted company outings there. The Pension Bureau also held the land subdivided and offered parcels for sale to the company executives and share owners and to the community leaders. Two later land acquisitions expanded the community size to 216 acres. In 1940, with many building lots unsold, the Afro offered them for sale to the larger Black community. And after World War II, home construction took off. Commercial establishment happened, motels and guest houses, restaurants, nightclubs began to spring up during, people were coming there for summer homes, and American Beach became a magnet for vacationing African American families across the country. And I've heard a lot about even my dad talking about his family taking, his parents taking him down to American Beach. So this is not, this is still like fresh in my family's memory. But on September 10th, 1964, Hurricane Dora slammed into American Beach, damaging and destroying many of the homes and businesses. And the damage was a setback for the community, but it proved minor compared with the setback caused, ironically, by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The legislation had opened all public facilities to African Americans. Former American Beach vacationers and day trippers now frolicked in Miami Beach, raced up and down the wide sands at Daytona, wore out the cobblestones of Savannah, and rode high at St. Simon's Island. All along the shore of the East Coast, Blacks explored areas that had once been off limits. The 3-day weekends at the American Beach shrank to 1 day. The Sunday visitors and day trippers no longer stayed overnight, and loaded buses no longer caused the bottleneck at the crossroads. With so little business, much of the restaurants and the resorts and the other establishments, they're closed once the Civil Rights Act was in place. So I've shared a lot of information. I want to pause. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can see people. And if you all have any questions, you can use the chat feature. I don't know, Regina, if you've seen any questions come in, but are there any questions about anything we shared today? Shamika. Hey, Shamika.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing well. It's I was, of course, look, I'm taking a lot of notes because you shared a lot of things with us today. Some things that I was aware of and some I wasn't. So I was like, oh wow, I always learn something every single time I'm a part of these calls. But when you started talking about the housing, the market and different things that have happened, Carlton and I were talking about it the other day, and even now going into different communities, there was a family that has lived near Norwood for a long time and bought their home years ago for like $30,000, $40,000. And you would think that now there would be some equity in the home, or, now it would appraise because they've done a lot of work on it as for, at least 50 to 60,000 more. But that's not the case. A family shared with us that, when they had their home appraised, that it was like sitting at like $40,000 or $45,000. And, being in a home for, 20, 30 years, and you realize there's no equity in your home, it's basically saying the home has no value, all because of where it's located, it's just been heartbreaking to hear the different stories, because they live in health zone 1, that their homes have no value. So when you mentioned that earlier, and you talked about like Sugar Hill, and you gave the housing report, and you talked about the red line and what happened and how people were pushed out, but it's just amazing that it's still going on to this day. And it's a shame because some have thought about selling, but I mean, with no equity and it's being appraised basically at the same amount that they purchased it years ago, there's no point. So I don't know exactly, what we could do, because that's mortgage companies, that's banks, but something has to be done because we hear it all the time. And I just heard this from a family, it had to be like 2 weeks ago.
Thank you, Shamika. And it brings to mind even I don't know if you all are familiar with the interracial couple a few years ago who had a home, I believe in either Riverside or San Marco area, an area that tends to appraise well, but because there were traces of the African American wife in the home appraised really low the first time. And so she had to go through the process of removing elements or decorations or pictures from their homes that would signal that she was an African American woman living there, and the home appraised for, I think, 40 or $60,000 more the second time. And so even, there's a lot of stigma, unfortunately, that even, and it's, I think it's easier to say, oh, it's just because of the neighborhood. But then you have another example where it's a neighborhood that we know that where, equity is going up, but having to remove traces of her Blackness. And so there are a lot of things in there to disentangle, Shamika, and I agree with you. There's a lot to be done in that space for sure. Thank you. And if you have questions, we'll come back at the end, but I want to make sure that you all have time to engage in your conversations today. And so if you have questions, continue to put them in the chat. We'll come back at the end and we'll do a debrief together, and we can even potentially answer some more questions that have come up. But that was a great question and comment. Thank you so much, Shamika. And so I want to just set up the conversations for today so that you also know what we call our rules of engagement. But when we created the race cards, we wanted to create a space where people felt like they could be vulnerable and they could share as much or as little about themselves as they felt comfortable. But we also ask that people be gracious in this space and be respectful of each other and have an open mind, because sometimes people will share things that they are not proud of. People will share parts of their lives that are really hard to talk about. And in particular, it may be hard to talk about these things with people you've never met before. And so we ask that you listen to learn, listen to the experiences, and not challenge the experience, but push each other's thinking. This is a safe space, and that we want you to be vulnerable and we want you to share. But this is also a brave space where we want you to also be pushing each other's thinking, because that's where we grow. That's where the growth happens, because it can be uncomfortable. I don't want to mislead you and say this is an easy conversation. But racism and experiencing it is also not easy. And being on the other side and trying to learn how to navigate what to say is not easy. But I encourage you to lean into what might be uncomfortable. And if you notice, sweaty palms or heart beating fast, or any sort of physiological response, don't be afraid to call that out in the room. I think that's where our breakthrough moments tend to be, when we can say out loud, ouch, that hurt. Or, I've had that experience too, or I had never thought about it that way, or this is really making me feel, anxious. Like, say those things out loud, verbalize to your group, because I think having that process together does a lot in the way of growth. And realize that people who are sharing in this space, they're not representing everybody in said group, whatever identities they bring to the table. It's their experiences, and it may be the experiences of others, but we don't want to attribute what someone shares in this space and say that everybody who carries these same identities thinks and feels this way. So I encourage you all to be vocal, turn your cameras on, really talk and engage with your groups. And without further ado, let's go ahead and get here and do what we came to do. Let's play the race cards, y'all. We'll come back to after to debrief together. So don't leave us. We'll promise we'll get you out at 1:00 for sure. So have a great time in your rooms. You'll be zapped in just a second.